Hey everybody. So I can't do this probably live because there's clearly a lot of things that I need to make coffee. But in this video, I'm just going to go over how I make a coffee every morning. I use a V60 to do a pour over. So for a V60, I'm going to need paper filters, these little triangle jobs. I'm going to need a scale to weigh my coffee. I'm going to need a grinder to grind said coffee. And I'm going to need some form of a kettle. As Laura will say, you don't need this hipster nonsense. I have a gooseneck kettle just because I like to flow or control the flow of water, but you can use any kettle that you have. And this is a Hario V60. There's multiple companies that make a pour over machine like this. So if you want to go out and find one, you can get Hario's, you can get Melita. There's a bunch of companies that make these. I just prefer this one. The Chemex is also essentially a pour over. You're going to need a coffee mug to pour into, and so the first step of this, of course, is to kind of gear up my setup. So put the Hario on top of the coffee cup, take one of my paper filters and insert it. Now the paper filter, this is, I believe, one of the ones made in Europe, so it's a brown paper. There's two other factories in Asia that make white ones, and the white ones I find are a bit better. They're a bit thicker and they don't sit nearly as high. So I'm going to go ahead and start boiling some water. So while this is boiling, I'm going to also weigh out my coffee. Now I use probably about 19 grams of coffee to 305 grams of water, which I think is 1 to 16 if I actually do the math. But don't ever ask me to do the math. Just a good idea. There's a cat. So I'm just going to cut open a new bag of coffee. I order coffee from 49th Parallel out in BC. They make a pretty good cup of coffee. They do a lot of small lot buys from smaller producers. Now, if I'm weighing anything that's less than an ounce, I'll tend to use a small gram scale. I just find it's more accurate when it comes to things under a certain weight than, say, the scale that I use for my water. The scale that I use for my water... Hey, what are you doing? Get out of there. So I use a gram scale, just easier to do a smaller amount of weighing when I'm weighing anything under like 28 ounces, so an ounce, or 28 grams, so an ounce. I'll use something like this. And just weigh out my 19 grams. And then this goes over to my grinder. Now this is a conical burr grinder. You can grind coffee in any way that you choose to grind coffee. You could do it with a mortar and pestle if you really wanted to, but you're looking for a consistency in grind. This tends to do that. Now you'll notice I also put a glass bowl on top of it. This prevents beans from popcorning, which is where a bean will hit the blade and pop up to the top. And it changes the way that multiple beans will grind, so you just prevent popcorning. So I'm waiting for this to heat up, and then I've got to do two things. Hey, you, get out of there. So I'm waiting for this to heat up, and then I've got to do two things. I've got to rinse this filter and heat the V60. Now the V60 that I'm using is ceramic, so it has worse thermal properties than the plastic one I normally use, but that is currently out camping with a friend. So we're going to go ahead and use the ceramic. So once this comes up to temperature, we're going to get it up to about 200. Generally speaking with coffee, I like the hottest that I can go. Specifically if I'm doing like a blonde roast or a light roast. In this case, I'm just using some, actually I don't even think this is, yeah, I think this is just a light roast. It's been washed for 18 hours and fermented. So I'm going to wait for this to come up to temperature, which is a lot of like waiting and sitting around. Now when this gets up to temperature, I'm going to grind my coffee as generally speaking, you want to grind your coffee the closest to brewing as you can. You're not going to lose a ton of the flavor of the coffee if you leave it sit there for a minute, but there are some coffee shops that won't let them sit for 15 seconds, so I tend to do it as quickly as I can after this boils. So that's coming up to temperature. Now there's a few things I'm going to have to do here, which is heat the V60 and the mug, as well as rinse the paper filter to get the paper taste out of it. So I'll disappear for a bit while I dump the water, and then with the remaining water I'll be able to brew my coffee. So with a V60, we're going to be pouring directly into the V60 in a circular motion to try and get the coffee to bloom first, and then to do the drawdown. So the drawdown is where the water actually goes through the coffee. Now this is going to get quite violent because it heats quite well. So now that it's ready, I'm just going to start to pour my water in. Now at this point it does not really matter how I pour, as I'm just heating. Now while I leave that water, I'm going to put this back on the heat and grind. When I've just zoomed the camera in and brought it a little closer to my V60, I've got the ground coffee. I'm just going to dump this in. Now I've already dumped out the water that I used to heat this and to prep the paper. So I'm just going to turn on a scale so I can get an accurate weight. Now I've got my hot water here. So the first thing I'm going to do is weigh out about 50 grams of water so that I can let the coffee bloom. Now this is where the coffee will actually let off some CO2, as there's CO2 in there. So I'll do a little bit of a swirl to mix that up, and I'll let that water come out. And I'm going to wait about 30 seconds from the time that I pour that water in to let the coffee bloom and get all of its CO2 out. You could wait as long as 45 seconds, but realistically, anything past the 30-second mark is totally fine. And then you're going to do 2 more batches of water that you add. You're going to go up to 200 grams in this weight, and then you're going to go from 200 to another 105 to bring it to 305 grams, 304 grams of water. The reason that you want to do that is now that it's kind of bloomed, we're going to go ahead and pour in a circular motion to try and keep that coffee bed flat. We're also going to try and get some of the grounds off the walls. But as we go, we're just going to get about 70% of the water in, just a good amount of the water, so that we can get a good level of heat in the V60. And then when it gets to 200, I'll stop pouring and let the water come down just a little bit. And then I'm going to start pouring at the exact same or as close to the flow rate as I can to keep the level fairly consistent. And in total, this should probably take about 2 minutes and like 30 seconds for its pull down, so the water to come through the coffee. I just find a gooseneck makes it a little bit easier to control the flow of water and to control while I'm going. If you use a larger kettle or a more like a less gooseneck kettle, just a regular kettle, you're going to be looking at just dumping in water, which is totally fine. You're just going to want to make sure you don't disturb the coffee bed, which is the coffee that's actually in the V60. So it'll probably come to about here, and it's just that leftover mash of coffee and water called the coffee bed that is left over. Now I make coffee like this every morning. I also make one usually most afternoons. And now that I've got my appropriate weight, I just have to wait for it to draw down. And then I get a cup of coffee. So as that goes down, you'll see some coffee residue around the edges. So that means I had some fines in my coffee, so like some ultra fine grinds. They get moved easily by water and they make kind of like a muddy mess along the side, so I could probably up my grind. But as this draws down, we're going to see the coffee bed that gets revealed at the bottom of the V60. How flat that is will give you an indication of potentially what your extraction was and how good your extraction was when you actually make your cup of coffee. Now this one looks like it's going to be fairly flat, which means I probably got a fairly good extraction out of this. And when we see the coffee bed begin to show at the very bottom of the V60, we know we're basically out of coffee, and at this point I can put this to the side and I'll just see if we can focus in on the coffee bed here, if it's not too dark. And it's actually pretty flat. So that's my cup of coffee. I don't know how you make your cup of coffee, but look forward to learning today. And if you can ever get one, if you're down at the head office, feel free to make sure that you steal a mug. Thanks everybody. Have a great day.